The wind did not howl. It screamed, a high, thin shriek that tore through the ponderosa pines and stripped the heat from the very marrow of Clara Dawson's bones. It was the kind of cold that did not just numb the skin but slowed the blood, turning the heart's rhythm into a sluggish, heavy thud against the ribs. She had been walking, or stumbling, for what felt like a lifetime. Though the sun had only dipped behind the peaks a few hours ago, the world had been reduced to two colors, the blinding, suffocating white of the driving snow and the gray, ghostly shapes of the timberline, and red. There was the red. Clara pressed her hand harder against her left side, beneath the rib cage. The wool of her coat was stiff there, frozen into a dark, jagged crust. Every step sent a fresh jolt of fire radiating from the bullet graze, a hot, sickly contrast to the biting frost that gnawed at her nose and ears. She could no longer feel her feet. Her boots, cheap leather meant for the boardwalks of a mining town, had soaked through miles ago, and now they felt like blocks of stone dragged through the drifts. Keep moving, she told herself, the thought forming slowly in her mind like molasses pouring in winter. If you stop, you freeze. If you freeze, they win. But they were far behind her now, swallowed by the storm. Lowell Crane's men might be vicious, driven by the promise of gold and the fury of a humiliated family. But they were not fools. No man rode in a blizzard like this. They would be huddled in a line shack or camped under a rock overhang, drinking coffee and whiskey, waiting for the sky to clear so they could find her frozen corpse. She stumbled over a buried root and went down hard. The snow rushed into her mouth, tasting of iron and ice. She lay there for a moment, the lethargy washing over her, seductive and warm. It would be so easy to just close her eyes. Get up. Clara! It was her father's voice, not the pious, wavering tone he used from the pulpit, but the sharp, terrified whisper he had used when he told her about the debt. The memory flared and died, replaced by the immediate, biting reality of the wind. She pushed herself up, her arms shaking. Through the swirling curtain of white, she saw a shape. It was too straight to be a tree, too angular to be a rock. It was a wall. Rough-hewn logs stacked against the elements, chinked with mud and moss. A cabin. A sob tore from her throat, lost instantly to the gale. She dragged herself forward, her legs obeying purely out of muscle memory. She reached the small porch, the wood groaning under the sudden weight of her collapse. There was a door, heavy and barred against the world. She raised a fist to knock, to scream, to beg for sanctuary, but her strength evaporated like breath in the cold air. Her hand struck the wood once, a dull, pathetic thud. Then the darkness took her, sweeping her away before she even hit the floorboards. Elias Hart did not like surprises. In the high country, surprises usually meant a grizzly waking early from hibernation, a rock slide taking out a trail, or a man coming to ask questions that Elias had no interest in answering. He had heard the thud against the door even over the roar of the storm. It was a sound that didn't belong, the impact of something soft and heavy, not the sharp crack of a branch. He sat in his chair by the hearth, a piece of oilcloth in one hand and the disassembled receiver of his Sharps rifle in the other. He reassembled the mechanism with fluid, practiced movements, the steel clicking into place with a sound of finality. He stood, his knees cracking slightly, and moved to the door. He did not open it immediately. He waited, listening. Silence, save for the wind. He lifted the heavy oak bar and pulled the door inward. The wind assaulted him instantly, driving snow into the warmth of the room. He looked down. A bundle of rags and snow lay across his threshold. No, not rags. A woman. Elias stared for a heartbeat, his blue eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. A woman up here, 10 miles from the nearest trail, in a storm that could kill a buffalo, was an impossibility. It was a trap. It had to be. He stepped out onto the porch, ignoring the cold that bit through his flannel shirt. He scanned the tree line, his rifle raised, thumb on the hammer. Nothing but the swirling white void. No horses, no shouts. He looked back down at the body. She was small, buried under a coat that was 3 sizes too big. A dark stain had bloomed on her side, freezing against the wood of his porch. "Damn," he muttered. The word was a puff of steam. He couldn't leave her there. Not even he was that far gone. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and bent down, scooping her up. She was terrifyingly light, a bird with hollow bones, her head lulled back, pale as the snow, her lips blue. He kicked the door shut behind him, sealing out the storm. The silence of the cabin returned, heavy and thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire. He carried her to the bed in the corner, a frame of pine logs lashed together with rawhide, covered in furs, and laid her down. He lit a second lantern, the yellow light washing over her face. She was young, perhaps 20 or 22. Her hair, dark and matted with ice, was plastered to her skull. Elias moved with the efficiency of a man who had spent years keeping men and animals alive in the worst conditions. He needed to get her warm, and he needed to see how bad the bleeding was. He pulled a knife from his belt. There was no time for modesty, and the buttons of her coat were frozen solid. He slit the heavy wool from collar to hem, peeling it away. Beneath was a dress of blue calico, stained brown with old blood and bright red with new. He cut that away too, along with the sodden petticoats and the chemise that clung to her skin like a second, freezing skin. He worked with rough, calloused hands. Yet he did not tear her skin. He stripped her down to nothing, tossing the wet, ruined clothes into a pile by the door. Her body was marble white, shivering violently even in unconsciousness. The wound was on her left side, just above the hip bone, a furrow of torn flesh where a bullet had passed through, missing the vitals but taking a toll in blood. The cold had actually helped, constricting the vessels, but now that she was warming up, it would start to bleed again. Elias grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the shelf and a clean rag. He poured the amber liquid over the wound. She whimpered in her sleep, her body arching slightly, but she did not wake. He wiped away the grime and gunpowder residue, his face grim. It wasn't deep enough to need stitches, but it needed binding. He tore a strip from a clean linen shirt he had been saving and wrapped her torso tight. Then he piled the furs on top of her, bear, wolf, and heavy wool blankets. He stood over her for a long time, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was a complication, a dangerous one. Women like this didn't just appear out of the ether. They were chased, and whatever was chasing her would eventually come looking here. He retreated to his chair, positioned strategically between the fire and the door. He picked up his rifle, wiped a speck of moisture from the barrel, and settled in to wait. He would not sleep. He would watch. Clara floated in a dark, hot void. Sometimes she heard voices, Lowell's booming laugh, the crash of glass, the scream of a horse. Sometimes she felt the cold again, biting at her fingers. When she finally opened her eyes, the world was still. She was warm. That was the first thing she noticed. A heavy, suffocating warmth that smelled of wood smoke, cured leather, and sage. She blinked, her vision blurry. Above her was a ceiling of logs, dark with soot. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in her side pinned her down. She gasped, the sound loud in the quiet room. "Easy." The voice came from the corner. It was deep, raspy, like stones grinding together in a riverbed. Clara turned her head, her neck stiff. A man sat in a rough wooden chair near the door. He was shadowed, but the firelight caught the hard angles of his face. A thick beard, streaked with gray, covered his jaw. His hair was long, tied back, but it was his eyes that held her, pale, watchful, and entirely devoid of warmth. And he was armed. A massive rifle lay across his lap, his hands resting on it as comfortably as a mother holds a child. Panic, sharp and electric, surged through Clara. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the log wall. The furs slipped down, and she realized with a jolt of horror that she was naked. She gasped, pulling the blankets up to her chin, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Where am I?" Her voice was a cracked whisper. Who are you? The man didn't move. He didn't even blink. You're in my cabin. I'm the one who pulled you off the porch before you froze to death. Clara looked around wildly. Her clothes were gone. Her boots were gone. She was trapped in a stranger's bed, naked, with a man who looked like he had been carved out of the mountain itself. My clothes, she stammered. Ruined, frozen stiff. I had to cut them off to get you warm. His tone was matter-of-fact, devoid of any leering suggestion, which somehow made it more unnerving. Clara's eyes darted to the door. It was barred. I have to go, she said, the irrationality of the statement lost in her fear. I can't stay here. She swung her legs out from under the furs, clutching the blanket around her like a shield. Her feet hit the cold floorboards, and her knees buckled instantly. She would have fallen if she hadn't caught the edge of the bed frame. The room spun. Storm's still out there, the man said. He hadn't moved a muscle to help her. He just watched. 5 feet of snow and wind that'll strip the skin off you. You go out that door, you won't make it 10 yards. Clara panted, steadying herself. I don't care. I can't be here. Suit yourself, he said, leaning back in the chair. But I ain't burying you till spring. The indifference in his voice stopped her. He wasn't threatening her. He wasn't trying to keep her. He simply didn't care if she died, as long as she didn't do it inside his house. She looked at him again, really looked at him. He was wearing buckskins and a heavy flannel shirt. A scar ran from his left temple down into his beard, pulling the corner of his eye slightly downward. He looked tired. He looked dangerous. But he was sitting across the room, fully clothed, holding a rifle as if the threat was outside, not in the bed. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving her trembling. She sank back onto the edge of the mattress. Why? She asked. Why what? Why did you bring me in? He looked at the fire, his expression unreadable. Dogs wouldn't leave a stray out in this. Clara pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping the fur tighter. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The warmth of the room began to thaw the frozen places in her mind. And with the thaw came the memories she had been running from. Silver Creek. The name tasted like ash. It was a town built on greed and mud, a place where men went to disappear and women went to be devoured. Her father, Preacher Dawson, had gone there to save souls. Instead, he had lost his own to the poker tables at the Gilded Lily. Clara remembered the night he came home, his face gray, his hands shaking. He told her he had found a way to fix everything. He told her that Mr. Crane was a generous man. Lowell Crane, the owner of the Gilded Lily, a man with rings on every finger and a smile that never reached his dead, shark-like eyes. He didn't want money. He wanted the preacher's daughter. He wanted something pure that he could dirty. You're to marry him. Clara, her father had said, refusing to meet her eyes. It's a good match. He'll take care of you, and he'll forgive the debt. She had tried to run then, but Crane's men were watching the house. For 3 days, she was a prisoner in her own home. Then came the night of the engagement dinner. Clara closed her eyes, the scene playing out behind her eyelids with sickening clarity. The private room at the back of the saloon, the velvet wallpaper, the smell of roast beef and stale cigar smoke. Lowell Crane dismisses her father. The click of the lock. Come here, Clara, he had said, pouring himself a brandy. Let's see what I bought. He hadn't wanted to wait for the wedding. He had backed her against the heavy oak desk, his hands, soft, damp hands, pawing at her dress. He laughed when she struggled. He liked the struggle. Your daddy sold you fair and square. Girl, you're mine. Now be a good wife. His hand had clamped over her mouth, stifling her scream. He smelled of pomade and rot. She hadn't planned it. Her hand had just flailed out, grasping for anything. Her fingers closed around the neck of the brandy bottle. She swung it with every ounce of hatred she possessed. The glass shattered against his temple. The sound was sickeningly loud. Lowell stumbled back, blood pouring into his eye, bellowing in rage. He lunged for her again, blindly. She didn't drop the broken neck of the bottle. She thrust it forward. It went into his throat. The silence that followed was absolute. Lowell Crane gurgled, his hands clutching at the jagged glass, his eyes wide with shock. He fell to his knees, then to his face. The blood spread across the Persian rug, dark and rich. Clara hadn't screamed. She hadn't cried. She had reached into his pocket, taken the roll of bills he carried, and climbed out the window into the alley. She stole a horse from the hitching rail, a roan mare that she had ridden until its heart burst 5 miles from the foothills. Then she walked. She had killed a man, a powerful man, and his brother, Silas Crane, was the sheriff. "You're thinking loud enough to wake the dead." Elias's voice cut through the memory. Clara snapped her head up. He was watching her again. "Who are you running from?" he asked. Clara stiffened. "What makes you think I'm running?" Elias gestured vaguely to her side. "Bullet graze. No horse. Dressed for town. Not the trail." "And you look like a rabbit expecting the hawk." Clara swallowed. "Bad men," she said softly. "Men who think they own people." Elias grunted. He seemed to accept this without judgment. He stood up, and Clara flinched, pressing back against the wall. He ignored her fear. He walked to the iron stove in the center of the room and poured a tin cup of something steaming from a pot. He brought it to her. "Drink," he ordered. "Broth, rabbit and sage. It'll put heat back in you." Clara took the cup, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, calloused like old leather, but his hand was steady. He didn't try to touch her. He didn't look at her naked shoulders or the curve of her legs beneath the blanket. He looked at her face, his expression guarded. She took a sip. It was salty and hot, the best thing she had ever tasted. She drank greedily. When she lowered the cup, she studied him. He was a large man, tall and broad-shouldered, but he moved with a quiet economy. He was scarred, not just the line on his face, but the way he held himself, as if he expected a blow at any moment. He was a creature of violence. She could see that. The rifle wasn't a tool to him, it was a limb. But he hadn't hurt her. "You saved me," she said, the words feeling strange. "I pulled you inside," he corrected. "You ain't saved yet, not with that hole in your side and winter set in." "I have money," she blurted out. I took money. I can pay you." Elias's face darkened. A shadow passed over his eyes, something old and painful. He took the empty cup from her hand and walked back to his chair. "I didn't save you for payment," he said, his voice low and hard. "Then why?" Clara pressed. "Men don't do things for nothing, not where I come from." Elias sat down, picking up the rifle again. He ran a rag over the walnut stock, his movements rhythmic, almost hypnotic. "This ain't where you come from," he said. "What is the price, then?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "There's always a price. Just tell me so I know." Elias stopped cleaning. He looked at her across the dim room, the firelight dancing in his eyes. For a moment, he looked impossibly weary. "Quiet," he said. "That's the price. Just be quiet." Clara closed her mouth. She pulled the furs up to her chin, watching him. The wind battered the cabin walls, whistling through the chinking. The fire hissed. Clara lay back down, but she did not close her eyes. She watched the man in the chair. He was a stranger, a killer, perhaps, a hermit living on the edge of the world. He had seen her naked. He had touched her to tend her wounds. He could do whatever he wanted, and no one would ever know. The snow would hide everything, but he just sat there, cleaning his rifle, guarding the door. She watched the play of muscles in his forearm as he worked the action of the gun. He was a terrifying figure, grim and silent. Yet, as the fire burned down to embers and the cold pressed against the logs, Clara realized something unsettled her more than his gun or his scars. For the first time in her life, a man had her at his mercy, and he wasn't asking for a thing. She didn't know if that made her safe, or if it made him the most dangerous man she had ever met. Elias felt her eyes on him. He didn't look back. He kept his focus on the sharps, checking the breech block for the 100th time. He shouldn't have brought her in. He knew it in his gut. She was in trouble. The bullet wound told a story, and the look in her eyes, part feral fear, part steel, told another. She had killed someone, or tried to. He had come up here to the high lonesome to get away from the blood, to get away from the screams of men dying in the mud of Virginia and Tennessee, to get away from the ghost of the boy he had been before the war took his soul and replaced it with cold iron. And now, the world had dumped a bleeding woman on his porch. He listened to her breathing settle into a rhythm. She was finally sleeping, exhaustion overcoming fear. Elias sighed, a sound like dry leaves scraping together. He rested the rifle across his knees and leaned his head back against the rough wood of the chair. He would need to check the trap line in the morning. Storm or no storm, he would need more meat. He closed his eyes, but his hand stayed on the trigger guard. He drifted into the light, restless doze of a soldier who knows the enemy is always just over the ridge. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the cabin, burying the tracks, burying the past. But Elias knew the truth that the mountains had taught him long ago. Nothing stays buried forever. When the thaw comes, the dead always rise. The storm did not break. For 3 days, the world outside the cabin ceased to exist, replaced by a howling white void that battered the logs and piled drifts high against the single window. Inside, time became a fluid thing, measured not by the sun, which was nothing more than a pale, bruised bruise behind the clouds, but by the rhythm of the fire and the throbbing ache in Clara's side. Recovery was a slow, feverish drift. Clara spent the first 2 days in a haze of pain and sleep, waking only when a rough hand lifted her head to press a tin cup to her lips. "Drink," Elias would say. It was never a request. She would swallow the bitter, hot broth, venison and sage, she thought, though her tongue was too coated to be sure, and then sink back into the furs. By the 3rd day, the fever broke. Clara woke with a clarity that was sharp and sudden. The room was dim, lit only by the orange glow of the hearth. She turned her head. Elias was there, as he always seemed to be, sitting in the high-backed chair near the door. He was whittling a piece of pine, the shavings curling onto the floorboards like pale ribbons. She watched him. He was a study in contradictions. He was a massive, imposing figure, his shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, his hands scarred and stained with gun oil. Yet, the way he moved the knife against the wood was delicate, almost tender. He felt her eyes on him. He didn't look up, but his hands paused. "Fever's down," he stated, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate on the floor. "How do you know?" Clara's voice was rusty, unused. "You stop thrashing, stop talking to people who ain't here." Clara flushed, pulling the bear fur tighter around her chin. "What did I say?" Elias finally looked at her. His eyes were the color of winter ice, clear and unsettlingly direct. "Enough to know you didn't have a happy childhood, something about a debt, and a man named Lowell." The name hung in the air between them, heavy and toxic. Clara looked away, staring at the rough grain of the log wall. "I didn't mean to burden you with that." "Ain't a burden," Elias said, returning to his whittling. "Just noise." He stood then, setting the wood and knife aside. He walked over to the bed. Clara flinched instinctively, her muscles tensing. Elias stopped, his expression darkening slightly. He held up a hand, palm open, showing he held nothing. "I need to check the dressing," he said, "unless you want the infection to take the leg." Clara swallowed her fear and nodded. She lay back, closing her eyes as he pulled the furs down to her waist. The cold air bit at her skin, but it was replaced instantly by the warmth of a damp cloth. His hands were rough. The calluses on his fingertips were like sandpaper, snagging slightly on the linen bandages. But his touch was shockingly gentle. He cleaned the wound with a focus that was almost reverent, not out of affection, but out of a sheer, practical respect for the mechanics of the body. He treated her torn flesh the same way he treated his rifle, something to be maintained, fixed, and kept functional. "It's closing," he murmured. "You're lucky. An inch to the left, and it would have clipped the gut." You'd be dead by now. Slow and hard. Thank you, she whispered. Elias paused, his hand resting near her hip for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Then he pulled the furs back up, tucking them around her with a brisk efficiency that bordered on dismissal. Don't thank me, he grunted, walking back to the fire. The ground's too frozen to dig a grave. Keeping you alive is just saving me the work. It was a lie. Clara knew it was a lie. She had seen him drying her dress by the fire, carefully turning it so the fabric wouldn't scorch. She had seen him staring into the flames when he thought she was asleep. A look of profound, ancient loneliness etched into his features. The cabin was small, a single room dominated by the stone hearth. As Clara's strength returned, the space seemed to shrink. The blizzard locked them in a forced intimacy that was both comforting and terrifying. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. They were two strangers circling each other in a wooden box buried in the snow. Clara began to move around, first just sitting on the edge of the bed, then standing, testing her legs. She felt light, hollowed out, but the pain in her side had dulled to a manageable throb. She found her clothes neatly folded in a crate. The blood had been scrubbed out, though the blue calico was stained a faint, permanent brown in places. The tear in the side had been mended with clumsy, tight stitches, black thread that stood out against the blue fabric. She dressed behind the privacy of a hung blanket Elias had rigged up, grateful to cover her skin. When she emerged, Elias was oiling his boots near the fire. He glanced at her, his eyes lingering for a moment on the mended dress before snapping back to his work. "You sew like a soldier," Clara said, touching the stitches at her waist. "It holds," Elias muttered. "Pretty don't matter up here." "It matters to me," she said softly. "Thank you for the modesty." Elias didn't answer. He was a man who seemed to view words as a limited resource, not to be wasted on pleasantries. But the silence of the cabin was heavy, and Clara, having spent years in a house where silence meant anger or fear, felt the need to fill it. "How long have you lived here?" she asked later, as the wind rattled the door on its hinges. "Long enough. Do you ever go to town?" "When I need supplies. Powder, salt, flour." "Which town?" "Does it matter?" Clara sighed, sitting on a three-legged stool across the fire from him. "I'm just trying to talk to you. Elias, you saved my life. I don't even know who you are." Elias set the boot down. He looked at her, really looked at her, with a scrutiny that made her skin prickle. "I'm nobody. That's the point. You were somebody before." Clara pressed. She nodded at the rifle leaning against the wall. It was a Sharp's buffalo gun, heavy and long range, but he handled it with the muscle memory of a combatant, not a hunter. "You handle that gun like you were trained to use it." Elias's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. "I was in the war," he said finally. The words came out like stones. "Tennessee, Virginia, sharpshooter, Union?" "Confederate. But after the first year, it didn't matter much. Blue, gray, mud's all the same color when you bleed in it." Clara watched the firelight dance on his scars. "Is that why you're up here? To forget?" Elias laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You don't forget. You just go somewhere where no one asks you to remember." He picked up a poker and jabbed at the logs, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "People are poisonous. Miss Dawson, they take what they want, destroy what they can't take, and call it God's will. I found I prefer the company of wolves. At least a wolf kills you because it's hungry, not because it enjoys the sound of you dying." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft. "You don't believe in God?" Elias looked at her, his face hard. "I saw a church burned down in '64, packed full of wounded men. Doors were barred from the outside. I heard them screaming for God while they burned." He didn't answer. "I figured if he was there, he would be cruel. If he wasn't, then we were alone. I prefer being alone." He turned his gaze to her, challenging her to be shocked. To be the preacher's daughter, he knew she was. Clara didn't flinch. She looked into the fire, her expression bitter. "My father was a man of God." she said quietly. He stood in the pulpit every Sunday, preached about charity, mercy, purity. She wrapped her arms around herself. He used to make me memorize verses. Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's. She gave a short, sharp laugh. When he racked up that debt at the poker table, he didn't have gold to give Caesar, so he gave it to me. Elias went still. He sat me down in the kitchen. Clara continued, her voice trembling slightly. Told me it was my duty, that a daughter obeys her father. He sold me, Elias, like a broodmare, to a man who looked at me like I was a piece of meat he couldn't wait to carve. She looked up, her eyes wet but fierce. So don't talk to me about God. If he exists, he stopped watching over women like me a long time ago. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of two people standing in the ruins of their own faiths, recognizing the wreckage in the other. Elias reached for a bottle on the floor, unmarked, amber glass. He pulled the cork with his teeth and took a long pull. Then, without a word, he held it out to her. It was a peace offering, an acknowledgement. Clara took the bottle. She had never tasted whiskey in her life. She raised it to her lips and tipped it back. The liquid seared her throat, hot and smoky, burning a path all the way to her stomach. She coughed, gasping, tears springing to her eyes. Elias's mouth quivered in the faintest ghost of a smile. Careful, that's trade whiskey. Strip the varnish off a table. Clara wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, handing the bottle back. It burns, she wheezed. But it helps. Yeah, Elias said, taking another drink. It does. That night, the dynamic in the cabin shifted. The whiskey had done its work, dulling the sharp edges of their defenses. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing coals, casting long, wavering shadows against the walls. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, watching Elias. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, one leg drawn up. He seemed more relaxed than she had ever seen him. The tension was still there, but it wasn't the tension of a coiled spring. It was something else, something heavier. She found herself studying the line of his throat, the broad span of his chest beneath the flannel shirt. He was a terrifying man. Yes, but he had listened to her. He had heard the worst shame of her life and hadn't judged her, hadn't offered platitudes. He had just offered her a drink. She felt a pull toward him, magnetic and undeniable. It confused her. She should hate men. She should fear them. Lowell Crane had taught her that a man's desire was a weapon. But when she looked at Elias, she didn't feel fear. She felt a strange, aching curiosity. Elias turned his head slowly. He caught her staring. For a long moment, neither of them looked away. The air in the room grew thin. Elias's eyes dropped to her mouth, then snapped away as if he had been burned. He stood up abruptly, the movement jarring in the quiet room. Get some sleep, he said, his voice rougher than usual. Storm's breaking. We'll have work to do tomorrow. He turned his back to her, retreating to his corner, pulling his coat around him like a barrier. Clara lay down, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could still feel the weight of his gaze on her lips. The scream tore through the cabin, shattering the stillness of the night. Clara was back in the room at the Gilded Lily. The smell of stale cigars was suffocating. Lowell was on top of her, his weight crushing the breath from her lungs. His hands were everywhere, wet, grasping, violent. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She could see the broken bottle in her hand, but her arm wouldn't move. He was laughing, a deep, wet sound that vibrated in her bones. No, she shrieked. No, please, get off! She woke up thrashing, tangling in the heavy furs, fighting an enemy that wasn't there. The darkness was absolute, terrifying. She scrambled backward, pressing herself into the corner of the bed. Hyperventilating. Clara! The voice was deep and real. A hand gripped her shoulder. She struck out blindly, a primal reaction. Her fist connected with something hard, a shoulder, a chest. Don't touch me. Don't you touch me. Clara, wake up. You're safe. You're here. Light flared. A match struck against stone. Then the lantern glowed to life, blindingly bright. Elias was kneeling beside the bed. He wasn't holding the rifle. His hands were raised, open palms showing. His hair was loose, falling around his face, making him look younger, wilder. Clara stared at him, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. The terror was slowly receding, leaving her shaking so violently her teeth chattered. "He was here," she sobbed, pulling her knees to her chest. "He was right here." Elias lowered his hands slowly. He didn't retreat. He moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bed. "He ain't here," he said firmly. "Nobody's here but us, and I locked the door." He reached out. This time, Clara didn't flinch. She leaned into his touch. His hand cupped the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. It was a rough, clumsy gesture, but it anchored her. "I can't," she gasped. "I can't make it stop." "I know," Elias murmured. "I know." He shifted, and suddenly Clara was clinging to him. She buried her face in the rough wool of his shirt, her hands gripping his arms. He was solid. He was real. He smelled of wood smoke and gun oil, not pomade and rot. Elias hesitated for a heartbeat, his arms hovering in the air. Then, with a surrender that felt like a defeat, he wrapped his arms around her. He held her tight, his chin resting on the top of her head. He didn't speak. He just held her while she shook, absorbing her terror into his own stoic silence. They stayed like that for a long time. The fire popped. The wind outside was a distant moan, no longer a scream. Slowly, Clara's breathing evened out. She became aware of the heat of his body, the steady, slow thump of his heart against her cheek. She realized how close they were. Her legs were tangled with his. Her breasts were pressed against his chest. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. His face was inches from hers. In the lantern light, the harsh lines of his face were softened. His eyes were dark, pupils dilated. The air between them changed again. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the same tension from earlier, but amplified by the adrenaline and the darkness. Clara's hand moved from his arm to his chest, resting over his heart. She felt it speed up. "Elias," she whispered. He went rigid. He started to pull away, his expression closing off like a shutter. "You should sleep. Don't go," she said, clutching his shirt. "Clara," warning, deep and guttural. "Why won't you touch me?" she asked. The question came out before she could stop it. It was the question that had been plaguing her since she woke up naked in his bed and found him across the room. "You saved me. You care for me. But you act like I'm diseased." Elias stood up abruptly, breaking her hold. He paced to the fireplace, turning his back to her, gripping the mantel with a white-knuckled force. "Diseased?" He let out a harsh bark of laughter. "Girl, you have no idea." He turned to face her. The look on his face was terrifying, not because of anger, but because of a hunger so raw it looked like pain. "I ain't a good man. Clara," he growled. "I told you, I've killed men. I've done things that would make your father's sins look like charity. I am a loaded gun. That's all I am." He took a step toward her, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "I don't touch you because if I start, I don't know if I can stop. You're soft, you're hurt, and I have been alone in the dark for a very long time." Clara stared at him. She saw the violence in him. Yes, but she also saw the restraint, the iron will it took to keep that violence in check. Lowell Crane had been a beast disguised as a gentleman. Elias Hart was a protector disguised as a monster. She threw off the furs and stood up. The cold air hit her skin. But she didn't care. She walked across the small room to him. She stopped inches away. She had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered. Elias stared down at her. His breathing was ragged. "You should be." "Maybe," she said, "but I'm not." She reached up and touched his face. Her fingertips grazed the scar that ran down his cheek. Elias shuddered. A low sound broke in his throat. His resolve shattered. His hands came up, framing her face, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. He looked at her like a man starving to death looking at bread. He lowered his head. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate. It was the collision of two broken things trying to make something whole. His mouth was hard, demanding, tasting of whiskey and smoke. Clara gasped, opening to him, her hands tangling in his long hair, pulling him closer. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the heat of his mouth and the crushing weight of his arms. The desire that had been simmering for days boiled over, hot and reckless. Then, just as suddenly, Elias tore himself away. He stumbled back, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with shock. He looked at her swollen lips, at the flush on her chest, and then he looked at his own hands as if they were covered in blood. "No," he rasped. "No, Elias?" Clara stepped forward. "Stay back," he warned, holding up a hand. I won't take anything from you. Not like he did, not like that." "You aren't talking," Clara said fiercely. "I'm giving." "You're confused," Elias said, his voice shaking. "You're scared and you're grateful and you're lonely. That ain't the same as wanting." He grabbed his coat from the peg by the door. "I need air. Elias, it's freezing out there." "I don't care." He threw the heavy wooden bar aside and shoved the door open. The wind swirled in, carrying snow and ice. He stepped out into the dark, slamming the door behind him. Clara stood alone in the center of the room, shivering, her lips still burning from his kiss. The silence rushed back in, but it was different now. It wasn't empty. It was charged, electric, vibrating with the knowledge of what had almost happened. She touched her mouth. He had stopped. He had wanted her. She felt the hard evidence of it against her body. But he had stopped. She walked to the window, wiping the frost from the glass. She couldn't see him in the darkness, but she knew he was there, standing in the snow, cooling his blood. "You're wrong, Elias," she whispered to the glass. "I know exactly what I want." Outside, Elias leaned against the rough logs of the cabin, the snow melting against his burning skin. He gripped the handle of his knife, his knuckles white. He breathed in the biting cold, trying to freeze the fire in his veins. He had almost lost control. He had almost become exactly what she was running from, but God help him. He wanted to go back inside. The desire didn't fade. It sat heavy in his gut, a deep, dark hunger that the cold couldn't touch. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that the storm inside the cabin was going to be far harder to survive than the one raging outside. The thaw did not arrive with a gentle warmth. It came with the sound of 1,000 weeping ghosts. The silence of the high winter was replaced by the relentless, maddening drip of melting ice. Water ran in rivulets down the groaning logs of the cabin, turning the pristine white drifts into gray. Heavy slush that sucked at boots and chilled the feet worse than the dry snow ever had. For Clara Dawson, the sound of the dripping eaves was the sound of a clock starting up again. The blizzard had been a suspension of time, a white wall that held the world at bay. Now, as the brown earth began to peek through the receding snow like bruised skin, she knew the world was coming back, but she was not the same woman who had collapsed on the porch weeks ago. "Pull it tight," Elias said, his voice low. "Not like you're sewing, like you're choking something." Clara knelt in the wet pine needles, her hands wrapped in strips of curing leather. She was wearing a pair of Elias's spare trousers, rolled up 3 times at the cuffs and cinched at the waist with a length of rope. His wool shirt swallowed her frame, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips. She looked like a child playing dress-up, but her eyes were sharp, focused on the task. She manipulated the sapling she had bent down, tying the noose of copper wire to the trigger mechanism Elias had carved. It was a twitch-up snare, designed to snatch a rabbit or a squirrel into the air before the wolves could get to it. "Like this?" She set the toggle, holding her breath as she slowly released the tension. The sapling held, vibrating slightly with potential energy. Elias stood over her, leaning on his Sharps rifle. He nodded once, a sharp, approving jerk of his chin. "Good. Place the guide sticks. Force the animal to step where you want it, not where it wants to go." Clara shoved twigs into the mud on either side of the narrow game trail. She stood up, wiping her muddy hands on her thighs. The motion felt natural now. The disgust she used to feel for dirt, for blood, for the rough realities of survival. It had been scrubbed away by necessity. "You learn fast," Elias noted. He turned and began walking further up the ridge, his stride long and silent. Clara hurried to catch up. Her boots, Elias's old pair, stuffed with rags to fit, crunching in the half-frozen slush. "I have to," she said. "I'm useful. Elias, I'm not just baggage." Elias stopped and looked back at her. The winter sun, harsh and glaring, caught the gray in his beard. "Never said you were baggage. You didn't have to. I felt it." She met his gaze squarely. "I chopped the wood this morning. All of it. I saw, and I mended your coat, and I set 3 snares yesterday that caught 2 hares. I ate them," he said, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "They were good." They walked on, falling into the companionable rhythm that had developed between them. It was a strange, fragile ecosystem. They were a team, functioning with a synchronized efficiency that surprised them both. Clara had taken over the interior of the cabin, organizing their meager supplies, keeping the fire fed, turning the grim, bachelor hovel into something that felt almost like a home. Elias provided the food and the security, the silent sentinel who watched the tree line while she washed clothes in the creek. But beneath the domesticity, the tension remained. It had shifted from the sharp, fearful edge of the first week to a heavy, humming current of awareness. Every time his hand brushed hers when passing a plate, every time she caught him watching her wring out her hair by the fire, the air between them grew thin. They reached the crest of the ridge. The valley below spread out like a map of desolation, a patchwork of white snow and black timber. Elias raised a pair of brass binoculars to his eyes. He stood motionless for a long time, scanning the horizon. Clara watched him. She had grown used to his vigilance, but today there was something different in his posture. The set of his shoulders was tighter. The way his fingers gripped the rifle stock was white-knuckled. "What is it?" she whispered. Elias didn't lower the glasses. "Smoke." Clara squinted. Miles away, to the southeast, a thin, gray wisp rose against the darker gray of the storm clouds gathering again. "Maybe it's another trapper?" "Trappers don't burn greenwood. The smoke's too black." Elias lowered the glasses, his face a mask of grim calculation. "And I found a boot print near the creek yesterday. Hobnailed heel. City boot. Not made for this terrain." Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach, instantly killing the warmth she had felt from the hike. "Is it them?" "Could be. Could be just drifters. Or the law." Elias turned to her. "But whoever it is, they're moving up country, towards the pass." "Towards us," she said. "We're high up," Elias said, his voice attempting to be reassuring but failing. "Hidden. They'd have to know exactly where to look." "Lowell's brother is the sheriff," Clara said, the fear creeping back into her voice. "He has trackers. He has money." Elias looked at her, and for a moment, the hardness in his face cracked. He reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of mud from her cheek. "Let's get back. Cover our tracks." The walk back was silent. The sense of freedom Clara had felt, the joy of the cold air, the pride in her snare, evaporated. The world was closing in. The walls of the canyon felt like the walls of a cell. That night, the wind picked up again, rattling the loose shingles on the roof. Elias sat by the fire, cleaning his revolver, a heavy Colt Army model that looked like a cannon in the dim light. He had been stripping and reassembling his weapons all evening, a nervous tic that Clara had learned to recognize. Clara stood in the open doorway, wrapped in a blanket. The cold air washed over her face, sharp and clean. The clouds had broken, revealing a sky so thick with stars it looked like spilled milk on black velvet. She stared at them, feeling small, feeling haunted. "You're letting the heat out," Elias said from the room behind her. Clara didn't move. "I don't know where to go. Elias." The scraping of the gun brush stopped. "I look at those stars," she continued, her voice soft. And I know the world is big, huge, but I feel like there isn't a single inch of it where I can just be. She turned to face him. He was watching her, the firelight casting deep shadows in the hollows of his eyes. If I go south, Crane's men will find me. If I go north, I freeze. If I go back to a town, any town, I'm just a woman alone. And women alone are just prey waiting to be caught. She leaned her head against the doorframe. I'm scared. Elias. Fear keeps you alive, he said. Not this kind. She shook her head. I'm scared of the law. I'm scared of men. I'm scared that if I ever let my guard down, even for a second, the boot will come down on my neck again. She paused, her voice trembling. And I'm scared of caring about anyone. Because everyone I ever loved either sold me or died. Elias set the revolver down on the table with a heavy clunk. He stood up and walked to the door. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He looked out at the stars, his expression distant, lost in a time and place she couldn't see. You think you're the only one who's ruined? He asked softly. Clara looked up at him. You're not ruined. You're strong. I ain't strong, he rasped. I'm just hard. There's a difference. He took a deep breath, the air hissing through his teeth. Stones River, Tennessee. 62. He said the place and date like it was the name of a disease. We were entrenched in a cedar thicket. It was raining. It always rained. The Yanks charged us right at dawn. It was hand-to-hand, bayonets, rifle butts, screaming. Elias stared into the darkness, his eyes unblinking. A boy came over the breastworks. Couldn't have been more than 16. Blue uniform that didn't fit him. He raised his rifle, but he hesitated. He looked scared, just a kid lost in the mud. Elias's hands clenched into fists at his sides. I didn't hesitate. I put a bullet in his chest from 3 feet away. Clara made a small sound, but she didn't look away. He fell right on top of me. Elias whispered. He didn't die right away. He just looked at me. He had blue eyes, bright blue, like the sky in summer, and he grabbed my coat, like he wanted me to help him. He tried to say something. Mama, maybe, or God, I don't know. The blood choked him. Elias turned to Clara then, and the agony in his face was so raw it hurt to look at. I watched the light go out of those blue eyes, and when it was gone, I realized something. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel anything. I just shoved his body off me and reloaded. He looked down at his hands, turning them over as if inspecting them for stains. That was the day Elias' heart died. Clara, what's left? This. He gestured to himself, to the cabin, to the empty wilderness. This is just the shell that kept walking. I stopped being human that day. I'm just a thing that kills to stay alive. He looked at her with a desperate, pleading intensity. So don't tell me you're scared of loving anyone. You should be scared of loving me, because there is nothing inside here but ash. Clara looked at the man before her. She didn't see a monster. She didn't see a shell. She saw a man who had been carrying a mountain of grief for a decade. A man who had convinced himself he was damned so he wouldn't have to feel the pain of hope. You're wrong, she whispered. She stepped away from the doorframe, closing the distance between them. She reached out and took his hand, the hand he claimed was only good for killing. She pressed it against her own chest, right over her heart. Can you feel that? She asked. He nodded slowly, his eyes locked on hers. You saved that, she said. You brought me in from the cold. You tended my wounds. You fed me. You listened to me. A shell doesn't do that. Elias, ash doesn't keep a fire burning. Clara, his voice cracked. You feel, she said, her voice fierce. You feel everything. That's why you hide up here, because it hurts too much. She reached up with her other hand and touched his face, her palm cupping his rough, bearded jaw. She traced the line of the scar with her thumb. I see you, she whispered. I see the boy who died in Tennessee, and I see the man who saved me, and I am not afraid of either of them. Elias made a sound that was half groan, half sob. The restraint he had held onto for so long, the iron control of the soldier, finally snapped. He didn't pull away this time. He surged forward. His arms went around her, crushing her to him, lifting her off her feet. He kicked the door shut with his boot, plunging them into the firelit dimness. His mouth found hers, and it wasn't like the first kiss. There was no hesitation, no testing of waters. It was a collision. It was starving for 10 years. It was rough and wet and desperate. He kissed her like he was drowning, and she was the only air left in the world. Clara met him with equal force. She wrapped her legs around his waist, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, closer. She needed this. She needed to feel something other than fear. She needed to know that she belonged to herself, and that she could choose who touched her. And she chose him. He carried her to the rugs in front of the fireplace. He lowered her down, not with the clinical care he used for her wounds, but with a frantic, worshipful urgency. "Clara!" He gasped against her neck, his beard scratching her skin. I can't stop." "Don't stop," she commanded, pulling at the buttons of his shirt. "Don't you dare stop." Clothes were shed in a frenzy of tangled limbs and heavy breathing. The firelight painted their skin in shades of gold and copper. When the skin finally touched the skin, the shock was electric. For Elias, touching her was an act of reclamation. Every inch of her he explored felt like a prayer he thought he had forgotten. He was terrified he would break her, terrified his roughness would surface. But his hands, though shaking, worshipped her. He kissed the scar on her side where the bullet had grazed her. He kissed the pulse in her throat. For Clara, it was a revelation. There was no taking here. There was no ownership. There was only a fierce, mutual need. His weight on top of her was heavy, grounding, shielding her from the world outside. Their joining was not graceful. It was a storm. It was grunts and gasps and the slap of skin. It was the release of a winter's worth of tension. It was tears mixing with sweat. It was Elias burying his face in her shoulder, making sounds that might have been weeping, and Clara holding him, anchoring him, whispering his name over and over again like a litany. It was a claim, but not of property. They claimed each other's pain. They claimed each other's survival. When it was over, the silence returned to the cabin. But it was a soft silence now. The air was heavy with the scent of musk and wood smoke. Elias rolled off her, collapsing against the rough log wall near the hearth. His chest heaved. His skin glistened with sweat in the dying light of the fire. He reached out blindly, his hand closing around the stock of his rifle where it lay on the floor. A reflex, an old habit that even passion couldn't break. Clara lay amidst the furs, her body humming, her mind floating in a haze of exhaustion and peace. She shifted, crawling across the rug until she reached him. She curled up against his side, resting her head on his broad chest, listening to the thunder of his heart slowing down. She felt his arm come around her, pulling her in tight. He buried his nose in her hair, inhaling deeply. They lay there for a long time, watching the embers glow and fade. The wind outside had died down, leaving a stillness that felt profound. "What happens now?" Clara asked. Her voice was small, a whisper in the dark. She felt Elias tense slightly beneath her. It was the question that could shatter the peace. It was the question that brought the boot prints and the smoke and the law back into the room. Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. To answer was to admit that this fragile, beautiful thing they had found was temporary. To answer was to acknowledge that the dawn would bring the world back to their door. Instead, he tightened his grip on her shoulder. He pulled the bearskin rug up over them both, cocooning them against the creeping chill. "Sleep," he breathed into her hair. He kept his arm around her, his body acting as a shield between her and the door. He didn't close his eyes. He watched the shadows dance on the ceiling, holding on to her as if she were the only anchor in a world that was drifting toward the falls. He held her until the gray light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the shutters, dreading the sun. wishing he could stop the rotation of the earth and live in this night forever. The dawn arrived not with the soft promise of spring, but with a gray, iron-hard light that exposed every crack in the cabin walls. The fire had burned down to sullen red coals. The air inside was thick with the scent of the night before, musk, sweat, and the phantom echo of desperate whispers. But the warmth had vanished, replaced by a chilling, purposeful distance. Clara woke to the sound of paper rustling. She reached out, her hand seeking the solid warmth of Elias's chest, but found only cold furs. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her throat, the memory of his hands on her skin still vivid enough to make her flush. Elias was sitting at the rough-hewn table. He was fully dressed, his flannel shirt buttoned to the chin, his gun belt strapped around his waist. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring down at a tattered map spread out on the wood, tracing a line with a charcoal-stained finger. "Elias," she whispered. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his face was a mask. The vulnerability she had seen the night before, the raw hunger and the grief, had been plastered over with the stony expression of the soldier. "Get dressed," he said. His voice was flat. "Coffee's hot." Clara felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach. She rose, pulling on her clothes, his clothes, with trembling fingers. She walked to the table, standing opposite him. She didn't look at the coffee. She looked at the map. It was a survey map of the territory, old and creased. His finger was resting on a railhead in Cheyenne. "The pass is clearing," Elias said, speaking to the paper rather than to her. "Snow's melting fast. 2 days' ride to the lower valley. From there, you can catch a stage to the rail line. Take the train east. Chicago, maybe, or St. Louis." Clara felt as though he had slapped her. The intimacy of the previous night, the way he had held her until dawn, suddenly felt like a lie. "Chicago?" "It's big," Elias continued, his voice methodical, reciting a plan he had likely constructed while she slept. "Crowded. A woman can disappear there. Change your name. Start over. I have some gold buried. It ain't a fortune, but it's enough to get you set up." Clara gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "You're sending me away." "I'm getting you to safety." "Safety," she repeated, the word tasting like ash. "Is that what this is? You think I'm a package you can just ship off to the next station?" Elias finally looked at her. His eyes were hard, but there was a flicker of something behind them. Pain, perhaps, or fear, that he was trying desperately to hide. "You can't stay here, Clara. We both know that." "Why?" she demanded. "Because the snow is melting? Or because of last night?" Elias flinched. He stood up, towering over the table, and rolled the map up with a snap of his wrist. "Last night was a mistake." "Don't you dare!" Clara hissed, her voice rising. "Don't you dare call it that! You felt it! I know you did!" "I felt a lot of things," Elias growled, turning away to pour coffee he didn't want. "That doesn't make them right, and it doesn't make you safe. Look at me, Clara. Look at where we are. I live in a shack on the edge of the world because I am not fit for company. You stay here. You bury yourself." "I would rather be buried here with you than alive and alone in a city of strangers," she countered, stepping around the table to face him. "I am tired of running. Elias, I am tired of men deciding where I go and who I belong to. My father sent me to Lowell. Now you want to send me to Chicago. Does anyone ever ask me what I want?" "I am trying to keep you alive," Elias roared. The sudden volume shook the dust from the rafters. "Do you think Crane's brother is going to stop? Do you think the law forgets? They will come, and if you are here when they do, you will die, or worse." "Then let them come," Clara said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "We can fight them. You taught me to shoot. You taught me to survive." "This ain't a game." Elias slammed his hand against the wall. "This ain't snaring rabbits. Clara, these are men who kill for coins. I can't watch another person die because of me." His voice broke on the last word. He leaned his forehead against the logs, his shoulders heaving. Clara softened. She reached out, placing a hand on his back. "Elias, you aren't that boy in Tennessee anymore. You aren't helpless." He spun around, shaking her hand off. The movement was violent, not in intent, but in desperation. "You don't know what I've done. You think you see a hero? You see a killer who got tired of the noise? I have done things. Clara, that would make the devil blush. I have burned farms. I have shot men in the back because it was efficient. I am poisoned. You stay close to me, and you get sick. That's how it works." "Then tell me," Clara challenged him. "Tell me everything. I can take it. I killed a man, remember? I drove glass into his throat and watched the light go out. I am not delicate." "You did that to survive," Elias spat. "I did it because I was told to, because I was good at it. Last night I forgot what I was. For a few hours, I let myself believe I could be a man again. But I woke up, Clara, and I remembered that men like me don't get happy endings. We just got to the end." He grabbed his coat and shrugged it on, the motion sharp and angry. "I'm going to check the horses. Pack your things. We leave at first light tomorrow." "Elias, please." "No more talk." He cut her off, his voice cold as the mountain wind. "I am not your savior. Clara, I am just the man driving the wagon that takes you away. Don't confuse the two." He stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him. The bar dropped into place with a final, damning thud. Clara stood in the center of the cabin, the silence ringing in her ears. She looked at the map on the table. She looked at the unmade bed where they had clung to each other. Tears pricked her eyes. Hot, angry tears. He was terrified. She saw it now. He wasn't rejecting her because he didn't want her. He was rejecting her because he loved her enough to break his own heart if it meant she kept beating. He believed he was a curse. "You stubborn, foolish man," she whispered. She paced the room, her mind racing. If she stayed, he would drag her to the train station in irons if he had to. He would force her to leave for her own good, and if she fought him, she would only distract him, make him vulnerable when the wolves finally came. But she wouldn't be passed along. She wouldn't be a parcel. Her eyes fell on the gun belt hanging by the door, his spare, with the old Navy revolver he rarely used. She looked at the larder, stocked with dried meat. If he wanted her gone to be safe, then she would go. But she would go on her own terms. She would draw the danger away from him. She would leave a trail so wide and obvious that anyone following would chase her. Not him. She would save him from the burden of saving her. Elias spent the day in the woods, chopping timber he didn't need with a ferocity that left his hands blistered. He didn't go back to the cabin until the sun was dipping below the peaks, casting the valley in long, purple shadows. He needed the exhaustion. He needed to be so tired that he wouldn't feel the phantom sensation of her skin against his. When he pushed the door open, the cabin was dark. "Clara?" Silence. He struck a match, panic flaring in his chest instantly. The lamp sputtered to life. The cabin was empty. Her small pile of belongings was gone. The spare revolver was gone. Elias turned and ran out the door, sprinting toward the lean-to stable behind the cabin. The gate was unlatched. His horse, the big bay gelding, the one with the stamina to run for days, was gone. The mule was still there, chewing hay placidly. He looked at the ground. The mud around the stable was churned up. Tracks led away, not toward the hidden pass to the east, but straight down the main game trail, south, toward the mining towns, towards the danger. "Damn it," Elias roared, the sound tearing from his throat. "Damn it, Clara!" She hadn't taken the safe route. She had gone back toward the world that wanted her dead. She was trying to draw the fire. She was trying to protect him. Elias didn't bother with a saddle for the mule. He threw a blanket over its back, grabbed his sharps and his saddlebags, and swung up. The mule protested, but Elias kicked it into a trot. He rode with a fury that blinded him to the cold. The tracks were easy to follow in the slush and mud. Too easy. She was riding hard, not hiding. She doesn't know, he thought, his heart hammering against his ribs. She doesn't know they're already here. The smoke he had seen yesterday, the boot print, they weren't days away. They were hours away, and she was riding right into their teeth. Clara had been riding for 4 hours. Her thighs burned, and her hands were numb where they gripped the reins. The bay horse was powerful, eating up the miles, but she was not a horsewoman. Every jolt of the gate sent a shock through her spine. She kept checking behind her, nothing but trees and shadows. She had to get far enough away. If she could make it to the river crossing, she could cut the tracks, send the horse on, and hide, or surrender. If she surrendered to the law, Elias would be safe. He would be just a hermit who had nothing to do with her. The trail opened up ahead. The sound of rushing water filled the air. The Snake River, swollen with meltwater, roaring and churning. A black ribbon cutting through the snow. She urged the horse toward the bridge, a rickety wooden structure that spanned the gorge. "Hold up there, darlin'." The voice came from the shadows of a rock outcropping to her left. Clara yanked the reins. The horse reared, whinnying in protest. She reached for the heavy revolver at her belt. But before she could clear leather, the crack of a rifle shot split the air. The dirt kicked up inches from the horse's hooves. The bay bolted sideways, throwing Clara. She hit the ground hard, the air rushing out of her lungs. She rolled, scrambling for cover behind a fallen log, gasping for breath. "Don't make it messy," another voice called out. It was gravelly, amused. "Legs are worth more than the head, but the head still pays." Clara peered over the rotting wood. 3 men stepped out from the tree line. They were not lawmen. They were dusters, hired guns, wearing long coats and wide-brimmed hats. They moved with the casual arrogance of predators who have cornered a rabbit. One of them, a man with a scarred nose and a Winchester resting on his shoulder, pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He held it up. It was a wanted poster, even from this distance. Clara recognized the sketch of her face. $500, the man said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Lowell's brother is a generous man. Said he wants you brought back alive so he can see you hang, but he didn't say you had to be in one piece." "Stay back!" Clara screamed, leveling the heavy pistol with both hands. It shook violently. "She's got teeth." The second man laughed. He was younger, with a red scarf. "I like 'em with teeth." "Drop the iron, girl," the third man said. He was the oldest, standing further back near the horses. "You ain't gonna shoot nobody." They began to advance, their boots squelching in the mud. They weren't afraid of her. To them, she was just a payday in a skirt. Clara squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand, the report deafening. The bullet went wide, burying itself in a tree trunk 10 feet to the left. The men laughed. "Now you made me mad," the scarred man said, racking the lever of his rifle. Suddenly, a sound cut through the roar of the river, a sound Clara knew. The distinct, thunderous boom of a Sharp's buffalo rifle. The scarred man's head snapped back as if he'd been kicked by a mule. A spray of red mist painted the air behind him. He crumbled to the ground before the sound of the shot even finished echoing off the canyon walls. "Sniper!" the older man yelled, diving behind a boulder. The younger man with the red scarf froze, looking up toward the ridge. That hesitation cost him a second boom. The bullet caught him in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into the mud. He didn't move. "Elias?" Clara whispered, a sob catching in her throat. "Cover!" the older man screamed, firing blindly up into the trees. Elias burst from the timber on the mule, abandoning the high ground to get to her. He was riding like a Comanche, low over the mule's neck, the sharp sheathed, his Colt revolver in his hand. The surviving bounty hunter saw him. He popped up from behind the rock, leveling his rifle. "Elias, look out!" Clara screamed. Elias saw the man. He fired, but the mule stumbled in the mud, throwing his aim off. The bounty hunter fired. Clara saw Elias jerk. His left arm flew back, blood erupting from the sleeve of his coat. He nearly fell from the saddle, but he clamped his legs tight, sliding the mule to a halt behind a cluster of birch trees 20 yards from Clara. He tumbled off the mule, landing hard on his good side. He scrambled to a sitting position, his back against a tree, gripping his left arm. His face was gray. "Stay down! Clara!" he shouted, his voice tight with pain. The bounty hunter laughed, a high, frantic sound. I got him. I got the son of a bitch. The man knew Elias was pinned. He knew a Sharps was useless at close range with one arm, and he knew Elias was hurt. He stepped out from behind the boulder, confident, his rifle raised, walking toward the birch trees to finish the job. You come on out, old man, the hunter taunted. I'll put one between your eyes, and then me and the girl are going to have a little party before the ride back. He was walking past Clara's log. He had forgotten about her. To him, she was just a hysterical woman who couldn't aim. Clara looked at Elias. He was trying to raise his revolver, but his hand was shaking, his strength draining away with the blood soaking his coat. He looked at her, and his eyes were filled with an apology. No. Clara stopped shaking. The world narrowed down to a single point, the back of the man's duster coat. She rested the barrel of the heavy Navy Colt on the log. She used two hands. She remembered what Elias had told her. Squeeze, don't pull, breath out. She didn't breathe at all. She squeezed the trigger. The gun roared. The bullet struck the bounty hunter in the spine, just below the shoulder blades. He arched backward, a strangled cry cutting off instantly, and fell face first into the slush. He twitched once, and then lay still. Silence rushed back into the clearing, heavier than before. The river roared. Indifferent. Clara stared at the body. Smoke curled lazily from the barrel of her gun. She felt a wave of nausea roll over her, violent and sudden. She had done it. She had taken a life. It wasn't like with Lowell. That had been a frenzy of panic. It was cold. This was an execution. Clara. She turned. Elias was trying to stand, using the tree for support. Blood was dripping from his fingers, staining the snow crimson. She dropped the gun and ran to him. She skidded to her knees in the mud, her hands hovering over his arm, terrified to touch him. You're shot, she gasped, tears blurring her vision. Oh God, you're shot! Through and through! Elias gritted out, his teeth clenched, bones whole. Just meat. He looked over her shoulder at the dead man. Then he looked at her. His eyes were filled with a mixture of horror and fierce, burning pride. You okay? He asked. I killed him, she whispered. He was going to kill us, Elias said. He reached out with his good hand, gripping her shoulder hard. You did what you had to. You hear me? You did what you had to. Clara nodded, wiping her eyes with a muddy sleeve. We have to go. More might come. My horse, Elias said, nodding toward the trees where the bay had run. Whistle. He knows you. Clara stood and whistled, a sharp, piercing sound Elias had taught her. The bay gelding, spooked but loyal, trotted back from the tree line. They struggled to get Elias into the saddle. He was heavy, and the pain made him gray and sweaty. Clara mounted behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, pressing her hands over his wound to staunch the bleeding. Hold on, she whispered into his ear. I ain't going nowhere, he mumbled, his head lolling slightly. They turned the horse back toward the mountain, leaving the three bodies to the river and the crows. The ride back was a blur of pain and cold. Night had fallen by the time the cabin emerged from the darkness. Clara practically dragged Elias inside. She stoked the fire until it roared. She tore strips from her petticoat, the clean white cotton she had been saving. She boiled water. Elias sat in the chair, his face pale as milk, his eyes half closed. He hissed when she poured the whiskey over the wound. Sorry, she sobbed. I'm sorry. Stop apologizing, he rasped. She worked with trembling hands, cleaning the hole in his bicep. It was ugly, purple and angry, but as he had said, it had missed the bone. The bullet had passed clean through. She wrapped it tight, tying the knot with jerky movements. Then she slumped to the floor at his feet, burying her face in her hands. The adrenaline had crashed, leaving her hollowed out and shaking. I didn't want this, she cried, her voice muffled by her palms. I left so you wouldn't get hurt. I wanted to save you. Elias watched her. The pain in his arm was a dull throb now, sharp but distant. The pain in his chest, seeing her broken like this, was far worse. He reached down with his good hand and touched her hair. "You saved my life, Clara," he said softly. "Back there, you saved me." Clara looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "I didn't want you to die for me, Elias. That's why I left. I couldn't bear it." "I know," he said. He looked around the cabin. It was small. It was rough. It was besieged by a world that wanted to crush them. But looking at her, kneeling in the firelight with his blood on her hands and a fierceness in her eyes that matched his own, he realized the truth he had been running from. He had been trying to send her away to a life of safety, but a life without her was just a slow death. He had told her he wasn't a savior, and he was right. He wasn't, but he was a partner. "I was wrong," he said. Clara sniffed, wiping her nose. "Wrong about what?" "About Chicago, about sending you away." He leaned forward, wincing slightly, and took her hand. His grip was weak, but it held on. "I can't protect you if you're 500 miles away," he said. "And I can't breathe right when you aren't here." Clara stared at him, her breath catching. "You stay," Elias said, the words sounding like a vow. "If they come, let them come. We'll fight them. We'll run if we have to, but we do it together. No more sending away." "You mean it," she whispered. "I mean it," Elias said. "You and me. Till the wheels fall off." Clara let out a long, shuddering breath. She leaned her forehead against his knee, closing her eyes. For the first time since she had walked out the door that morning, the cold in her bones began to recede. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the pines. But inside, the fire was warm. The door was barred, and the rifle was loaded. They were bloodied, they were hunted, and they were terrified. But they were together. And for tonight, that was enough. The cabin, once a sanctuary of silence and wood smoke, had become a skeleton. The furs were rolled and lashed to the pack saddle of the mule. The meager pantry of dried venison and flour was emptied into saddlebags. The fire was dead, a heap of gray ash that smelled of finality. Elias' heart moved through the space with the efficiency of a man who had spent a lifetime leaving places behind. He checked the shutters, barring them tight, though he knew he would likely never return to unbar them. It was a habit of the frontier. You left a shelter standing for the next poor soul who might stumble out of a blizzard. Clara watched him from the doorway. She was dressed in her own clothes now, the blue calico washed and mended, worn under a heavy woolen coat Elias had cut down to fit her. She felt a strange, aching grief. This four-walled box of logs had been a prison, then a hospital, and finally, a home. "We ride at noon," Elias said, not looking at her. He was tightening the cinch on the bay gelding. His left arm was stiff, wrapped in fresh linen, but he used it with a grim determination, refusing to favor the wound. "I'll be ready," Clara said. Elias nodded and walked out the back door, carrying a small rusted spade. Curiosity, sharp and sudden, pricked at Clara. She waited a beat, then moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. Elias walked to the edge of the clearing, near a stand of wind-twisted pines. He knelt in the mud, the earth soft from the thaw. He dug a small, shallow hole. From the inside of his coat, he pulled a battered tin box, the kind tobacco came in. He held it for a long moment, his thumb tracing the lid, his head bowed as if in prayer. Then, he placed it in the hole and covered it with dirt, patting the earth down until it looked undisturbed. He stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and walked toward the creek to fill the canteens. Clara knew she shouldn't. It was an invasion. It was a violation of the fragile trust they had built. But the mystery of Elias' heart was a knot she couldn't leave untied. She needed to know what he was burying before they walked away from his life forever. She slipped out the back door. She ran to the pines, falling to her knees in the damp soil. She dug with her hands, her fingernails scraping against the tin. She pulled the box out. It was cold and heavy. She pried the lid open. Inside, there was no gold, no map, no locket, just a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. The ink faded to brown. Clara unfolded it. The handwriting was cramped and jagged. The script of a man writing by firelight with a shaking hand. September 1865. Dear Thomas, I'm writing this because I cannot say it to the air. If I say it out loud, it becomes real, and if it is real, I will have to put the pistol in my mouth. I am still walking. I do not know why. I wake up every morning and I breathe, and I hate myself for the breath. I see your face in the fire. I see the faces of the others in the trees. You were a boy. You had a mother waiting in Ohio. I had nothing but a rifle and orders. They call it peace now, but there is no peace. There is only the silence after the scream. I am looking for a place where the silence is loud enough to drown you out. I do not deserve to be here. I do not deserve the sun or the water or the taste of bread. But I am a coward. Thomas, I cannot kill myself. I have seen too much death to want to rush toward it. So I will bury myself in the high country. I will be a ghost that breathes. Forgive me. Or don't. I will never forgive myself. Elias. Clara sat back on her heels, the letter trembling in her hands. The wind sighed through the pines, a lonely, mourning sound. He hadn't saved her because he was a hero. He hadn't saved her because of duty. He had saved her because he was a man drowning in his own survival, desperate to prove that his hands could do something other than destroy. He had pulled her from the snow to balance a ledger that could never be balanced. But in saving her, he had failed in his mission to be a ghost. He had come back to life. Clara. She froze. Elias was standing at the edge of the trees, the dripping canteens in his hands. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. Clara didn't try to hide the letter. She stood up, clutching it to her chest. You wrote this to the boy, the one you told me about. Elias dropped the canteens. He took a step toward her, his eyes dark. That wasn't for you to see. You think you're a coward, she said, her voice breaking. You think you're being punished by being alive. I am, he rasped. Look at me. I am a killer hiding in the woods. I have nothing to give a woman. Nothing but blood and bad memories. Clara walked to him. She didn't stop until she was pressing the letter against his chest, forcing him to take it, or to take her. You're wrong, she said fiercely. You think you saved me. You think you pulled me out of the storm and that was it? Elias, look at me. He looked at her, pain warring with anger in his gaze. I was dead before I hit your porch, she whispered. I was dead in that room with Lowell. I was dead when my father sold me. You didn't just save my life. You gave it back to me. And you didn't do it because you're a ghost. You did it because you are a good man who is terrified of his own goodness. She took the tin box from his hand and dropped it. She took the letter and crumpled it, letting it fall to the mud. Leave it buried, she said. Thomas is gone. You are here, and I am here. Elias stared at the crumpled paper. His chest heaved. The walls he had built for 10 years, the walls of guilt and solitude, trembled. He looked at Clara, standing in the mud, fierce and alive and demanding he exist. He made a sound, a low, broken noise in his throat, and pulled her into him. They did not leave at noon. The sun moved across the sky, dipping toward the western peaks, but the cabin door remained barred. Inside, the fire had been rekindled, casting a warm, flickering glow over the empty room. This time, there was no desperation. There was no frantic clawing at clothes, no hunger born of fear. Elias undressed her slowly. His hands, usually so efficient and rough, were trembling. He treated her body not like a desperate anchor, but like a sacrament. He traced the scar on her side, his fingers light as breath. He kissed the pulse of her wrist. He worshipped the life he had saved. Clara guided him down to the firs. She looked into his eyes, those pale, winter eyes, and saw the ice melting. She saw the man beneath the soldier. Elias, she whispered, her hands framing his face. He moved over her, his weight familiar now, a comfort rather than a threat. He entered her slowly, holding her gaze, making sure she knew, making sure she felt that this was not taking, this was giving. It was a silent conversation. Every touch said, I am here. Every kiss said, I am yours. When the crest came, it was quiet and profound, a shudder that went through both of them, binding them together in the darkening room. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blankets, the firelight dying down again. Elias ran his hand down the length of her arm, marveling at the softness of her skin against his calloused palm. "I want to be your wife," Clara said. She spoke the words into silence, simple and absolute. Elias went still. He pulled back slightly to look at her face. "Clara, I have nothing. No land, no money, just a horse, a gun, and a price on my head if I stay with you." Clara reached up and touched his lips to silence him. "You gave me shelter when I was freezing," she said. "You gave me food when I was starving. You gave me safety when I was hunted. And you gave me yourself, even when you thought you had nothing left to give." She kissed his palm. "You gave me everything. Elias, the rest is just geography." Elias closed his eyes, a single tear leaking out to track through the grime on his cheek. He pressed his forehead against hers. "Then I'm yours," he whispered, "for as long as I have breath." The descent the next morning was brutal. The thaw had turned the mountain trails into treacherous slides of mud and slush. The horses struggled, their hooves slipping on hidden rocks. Elias rode point, the Sharp's rifle resting across his saddle, his eyes scanning every ridge, every shadow. Clara followed on the mule, her heart pounding in rhythm with the animal's gait. They had a good time despite the conditions. By mid-afternoon, they had reached the lower foothills, where the pines gave way to scrub oak and sagebrush. The air was warmer here, thick with the scent of wet earth, but the feeling of dread that had settled in Clara's stomach would not leave. "We're close to the valley floor," Elias called back, his voice low. "Another hour, and we'll hit the old logging road. From there, we can cut east." He turned back around. The crack of the rifle was the first warning. It came from the rocks above them, a sharp, flat sound that echoed instantly. Elias's horse screamed. The animal reared, twisting in the air as a bullet tore through its neck. Elias was thrown, hitting the muddy ground with a sickening thud. "Elias!" Clara shrieked. "Get down!" he roared, rolling instantly to cover behind a fallen log. The canyon erupted. Gunfire poured down from the cliffs on both sides. It was a crossfire. A trap. Clara threw herself off the mule, scrambling through the brush toward Elias. Bullets kicked up geysers of mud around her. She could hear the angry buzz of lead passing inches from her head. She dove behind the log next to him. Elias was already returning fire, the boom of his Sharps distinct and terrible above the lighter crack of the Winchester repeaters raining down on them. "They were waiting," Elias gritted out, racking the lever of his rifle. "They knew we'd come this way." He popped up, fired, and ducked back down as a chunk of wood exploded near his face. "One down." "How many?" Clara gasped, fumbling for her own revolver. "Too many. 6. Maybe 7. He looked at her, his face streaked with mud. "We can't stay here. They'll flank us in 2 minutes." "Where do we go?" "The creek." Elias pointed to the right, where the land dropped away sharply into a ravine choked with willow and ice. "Current cuts under the bank. It's our only chance." He turned to fire again, covering her movement. But as he rose, a bullet caught him. It wasn't a graze this time. It struck him in the thigh, punching through the heavy muscle. Elias cried out, his leg buckling. He collapsed back behind the log, clutching the wound. Blood, bright and arterial, pulsed between his fingers. "Elias! Go!" he snarled, his face white with shock. "Move, Clara! I'm not leaving you." She grabbed him by his coat collar. Get up, or we both die!" Driven by her fury, Elias forced himself up. He leaned heavily on her, dragging his shattered leg. Together, they stumbled toward the edge of the ravine. Bullets whined around them. One tugged at Clara's sleeve. Another struck the ground at her heel. They reached the lip of the drop and slid. It was an uncontrolled fall, a tangle of limbs crashing through brush and sliding over slate. They hit the icy water of the creek with a bone-jarring splash. The cold was a physical blow. It punched the air from Clara's lungs. The water was waist-deep and moving fast, gray with meltwater. "Under the bank," Elias gasped. He dragged himself toward an overhang where the floodwaters had undercut the earth, creating a shallow cave obscured by hanging roots and ice. They collapsed into the shadows, shivering violently. The water swirled around their waists, numbing their legs instantly. Elias slumped against the mud wall, his face gray. The water around him was turning pink. "Tie it off," he whispered, fumbling with his belt. Clara's hands were numb, but she worked with frantic desperation. She unbuckled his belt and cinched it around his thigh, high up, pulling it until Elias groaned and his eyes rolled back. The bleeding slowed. Above them, the gunfire had stopped. "They went over the edge," a voice shouted. "I saw 'em fall." Boots crunched on the gravel above. Stones skittered down the embankment, splashing into the water. "Flush 'em out," another voice ordered, a voice Clara knew. Silas Crane. Elias gripped his revolver. His hand was shaking so hard the barrel tapped against his knee. He looked at Clara. His eyes were dimming. He was losing too much blood. He couldn't fight. He couldn't aim. "Clara," he whispered. "Swim downstream. Get away." "No," she said. Her teeth were chattering. "No!" She looked at him, broken, bleeding, dying for her. And she looked at the water, and the roots, and the death waiting above. She made a choice. She stood up. "Clara!" Elias hissed, trying to grab her, but his fingers slipped on her wet coat. Clara waded out from under the overhang. She stepped into the middle of the creek, the water rushing around her thighs. She stood in the open, her hands raised. "Stop!" she screamed. Her voice echoed off the canyon walls. Silence fell. On the bank above, 5 men appeared. In the center stood Silas Crane. He looked like his brother, but harder, leaner. He wore a sheriff's star that gleamed dull in the overcast light. He held a repeater rifle. He stared down at her, a sneer curling his lip. "Well now, the little bird comes out of the nest. Let him go," Clara called out. Her voice was steady, cold as the river. Silas laughed. "You're in no position to bargain, girl. You killed my brother, and your man there killed 3 of my deputies." "I killed Lowell," Clara said. "It was me, just me. Elias was just a way to get through the snow. He doesn't matter." She took a step forward, the water churning. "I will come with you. I will let you put the cuffs on me. I will stand trial. I will let you hang me if that's what you want. But you leave him. He's dying anyway. Let him die in peace." Silas studied her. He lowered his rifle slightly. "You'd trade your neck for a mountain man. I'm trading justice for revenge. Silas, you want me. You have me. Just walk away." Silas considered this. He looked at his men. They were tired, muddy, and spooked by the sniper fire. "All right," Silas said, spitting into the water. "Come on up. We'll leave the carcass for the wolves." Clara let out a breath. She took a step toward the bank. "No," the voice was low, guttural, a sound torn from the bottom of a grave. Clara turned. Silas raised his rifle again. Elias was dragging himself out from the overhang. He was soaked, mud-smeared, his leg trailing uselessly behind him like a dead weight. He looked like a corpse that had refused to stay buried. His skin was the color of parchment, his lips blue, but his eyes were burning with a fire that terrified the men on the bank. He clawed his way up a mossy rock, propping himself up on his good knee. He raised the heavy Colt Navy revolver. It didn't shake this time. He willed his hand to be stone. "Elias, stop!" Clara cried. "I can save you." Elias didn't look at her. He looked at Silas Crane. "You want her?" Elias rasped. He cocked the hammer of the revolver. The click was loud in the canyon. "You'll take her over my dead body." Silas aimed his rifle at Elias's chest. "That can be arranged. Trapper." "Go ahead," Elias challenged. "You might kill me, but I promise you, Sheriff, before I hit the water, I will put a bullet in your gut, and you will die screaming in this creek just like your brother died choking on his own blood." There was a silence that stretched for an eternity. The wind moaned. Silas looked at Elias. He saw the man's finger on the trigger. He saw the absolute, suicidal certainty in his eyes. Elias' heart was already dead. He was just waiting for company. Silas looked at Clara, shivering in the water, her face filled with terror and love. He looked at the bodies of his hired men scattered on the trail above. The hate that had driven him for months suddenly felt heavy, useless. His brother was dead. Lowell had been a monster. Silas knew that better than anyone. Was he really going to die in a freezing ditch for a ghost? Silas lowered the rifle. "Damn you," Silas muttered. "Damn you both to hell." He uncocked the gun. "Let's go," he barked at his men. "But boss," one of the deputies started. "I said let's go," Silas roared. "It's done. Let the mountain have them." He turned his horse and rode away, not looking back. The hired men hesitated, looked at the wild-eyed man in the creek with the steady gun, and followed. The sound of hooves faded into the distance. Elias held the gun up for 10 seconds. 20, finally. When the silence was absolute, his arm dropped. The revolver splashed into the water. He slumped forward, sliding off the rock. "Elias!" Clara scrambled through the water, catching him before he went under. She pulled his heavy, limp body against her chest, struggling to keep his head above the surface. "I got you," she sobbed, dragging him toward the bank. "I got you. Elias, stay with me. Please, stay with me." He was dead weight. His eyes were closed, but as she hauled him onto the muddy bank, collapsing beside him in the slush, she saw his chest rise, a shallow, ragged breath. He was alive. Clara lay her head on his chest, weeping uncontrollably, the icy water soaking them both, while the sun finally broke through the clouds above, casting a weak, golden light on the blood-stained snow. The town of Cedar Ridge sat in a shallow valley where the high desert met the foothills, a collection of raw lumber buildings and false fronts that smelled of sawdust, horse manure, and wet earth. It was a place for people who were passing through, or for people who had nowhere else to go. It was quiet, respectable enough on the surface, and far enough from the mining camps that the mud in the streets wasn't mixed with gold dust or blood. Elias Hart and Clara Dawson arrived in a wagon they had purchased from a homesteader 3 days south of the river. They looked like any other couple worn down by the frontier, a man with a limp and a face carved from granite, and a woman with eyes that had seen too much horizon. They gave their names as Mr. and Mrs. Hart. No one asked for a marriage license. In the West, a shared name and a shared wagon were proof enough. They rented 2 rooms above a general store on the edge of town. It was modest, a stove, a bed, a window that looked out over the sagebrush plains to the west. For the first time in months, they had 4 solid walls and a roof that didn't leak. But for Elias, the walls did not feel like safety. They felt like a cage. He struggled to adapt to the rhythm of peace. The silence of the mountains had been a living thing, something he understood. The silence of the town was different. It was broken by the slam of a door, the laugh of a drunk, the rattle of a passing carriage. Every sound made his hand twitch toward his hip. He found work at the livery stable at the south end of town. It was hard. Dirty work, mucking stalls, shoeing horses, repairing tack, but it kept his hands busy and allowed him to stay in the shadows. He spoke little. The townspeople learned quickly that the big, scarred man with the stiff leg was not one for conversation. They respected his strength and feared his eyes, which was exactly how Elias wanted it. At night, the war came home. He could not sleep in the bed. It was too soft, too elevated. He felt exposed. While Clara slept, exhausted from her own days, Elias would prowl the small apartment. He checked the lock on the door 3 times an hour. He stood by the window, watching the street below, waiting for the duster coats, for the glint of a sheriff's star, for the retribution he was certain was coming. When he finally did sleep, it was on a bedroll on the floor, positioned so that he could see both the door and the window. His Colt Navy revolver was under his pillow, the Sharps rifle, cleaned and oiled, leaned against the wall within arm's reach. Clara, conversely, bloomed. It was a slow blossoming, hesitant at first, like a wildflower pushing through charred earth. She found work as a seamstress for the widow Higgins, a stern woman who ran the town's only dress shop. Clara had good hands. Hands that could snare a rabbit or stitch a wound could also mend fine silk and hem trousers. She began to hum while she worked. She made friends. The baker's wife, the school teacher. She walked the boardwalks without keeping her head down. She was reclaiming the humanity that Lowell Crane had tried to beat out of her. But she felt the weight of Elias's fear. She saw it in the dark circles under his eyes, in the way he stood between her and the door whenever they entered a room. He was with her, but he was not here. He was still in the cabin, still in the creek, waiting for the next bullet. Months passed. The heat of summer baked the mud into hard ruts, and the cottonwoods along the creek turned gold. One evening, Clara came home to find Elias cleaning his gun. Again, the smell of solvent was sharp in the small room. "I spoke to a man today," Clara said, setting her basket on the table. Elias didn't look up. "What man?" "Mr. Thaddeus Moore. He is a lawyer. He has an office above the bank." Elias's hands froze. He looked up slowly, his face darkening. "Why were you talking to a lawyer?" "Clara, I asked him to look into it," she said, her voice steady, though her hands were trembling slightly. "The charges, the warrant." Elias stood up so fast the chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. "Are you mad? You gave him your name?" "I gave him my name," Clara said. "I told him who I was. I told him I killed Lowell Crane in self-defense." "You led them right to us," Elias whispered, pacing the room, his limp more pronounced in his agitation. "You lit a signal fire. Clara, Lowell's brother isn't the only lawman in the territory. There is a federal warrant. If they find out you are here—" "I am tired of hiding." "Elias," Clara snapped. "I live in this town. I walk these streets. But I am a ghost. I jump every time I see a man with a badge. I cannot live like that. I want to be free, truly free." "Freedom is staying alive," Elias countered, grabbing her shoulders. "The law doesn't care about your freedom. It cares about paper. And the paper says you are a murderer." "Then I will change the paper," she said, pulling away. "Mr. Moore said he has contacts in Silver Creek. He said he can send inquiries without revealing where I am. He believes there might be mitigating circumstances." "Hope is a dangerous thing," Elias said, his voice hollow. "It gets you killed." "No, Elias," she said softly, touching his cheek. "Fear gets you killed. Hope is what keeps you walking." The weeks that followed were agonizing. Elias barely slept. He began to stockpile supplies again: bullets, dried meat, beans. He scouted routes out of town. He watched the road to the south, expecting a posse to ride in with every cloud of dust. Clara worked, and she waited. She held Elias at night when the nightmares came, soothing the tremors in his scarred body, whispering that it would be all right, even though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Then the letter came. It was a Tuesday in late October. The first frost had dusted the rooftops. Elias was at the stable, shoeing a roan mare, when Clara appeared in the doorway. She was pale, holding a thick envelope with an official wax seal. Elias dropped the hammer. He felt the blood drain from his face. This was it, the summons, the end. "Clara," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Go back to the room. Pack the bags. I'll saddle the horses." "Elias, stop," she said. Her voice was strange, choked. "We don't have time," he urged, limping toward the tack room. "If the courier is here, the marshal isn't far behind." "Elias," she shouted. He stopped. He turned to look at her. She was crying. "Read it," she said, holding the paper out. He took it with reluctant hands. He read the script slowly, his lips moving with the words. It was from the district attorney's office in the territorial capital. "Investigation into the affairs of the deceased Lowell Crane has revealed a network of illicit trafficking and extortion. Testimony provided by 3 other women held against their will at the Gilded Lily corroborates the claim of self-defense. Sheriff Silas Crane has been removed from office pending federal indictment for corruption." Elias read the last paragraph 3 times. All charges against Miss Clara Dawson are hereby dismissed. The warrant is vacated. You are a free woman." The paper rattled in his hand. The sounds of the stable, the horses chewing, the flies buzzing, seemed to fade away. The crushing weight that he had carried on his shoulders since the moment he pulled her off his porch, the weight of her potential death, simply vanished. He looked at Clara. She was smiling through her tears. "He was a monster," she whispered. Everyone knew. They finally said it. They finally spoke up. Elias couldn't speak. He felt lightheaded. He sat down heavily on a bale of hay, the letter fluttering to the dirt floor. "Gone," he breathed. "It's gone. It's over," Clara said. She walked to him and knelt in the straw, taking his rough, blackened hands in hers. "We don't have to run, Elias. We don't have to hide. We can just be." Elias looked at her, and for the first time, the fear in his eyes broke. It shattered completely, leaving behind a naked, bewildered vulnerability. He leaned forward and buried his face in her neck. He didn't weep. He didn't have the tears left. He just shook. He held on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a universe that had suddenly shifted on its axis. "I was so sure," he murmured into her hair. "I was so sure I was going to lose you." "You're stuck with me," she said, stroking his back. "You foolish man. You're stuck with me." That night, the apartment was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of waiting for the blow. It was the silence of peace. Elias sat on the edge of the bed. Clara was brushing her hair at the vanity he had built for her. "I have something for you," she said. She put the brush down and opened the top drawer. She pulled out a folded document. It wasn't a legal letter this time. It was a deed. She walked over and handed it to him. Elias unfolded it. It was a title for 40 acres of land just north of town. Good land, bottomland near the creek, with timber on the ridge and enough pasture for a herd. "How?" Elias asked, staring at the paper. I don't have this kind of money." "I have been saving," Clara said. "Every dollar from the sewing, and I had a little left from what I took from Lowell. I figured it was blood money, so I should use it to buy something that could bleed clean." She sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee. "It has a cabin," she said. "It needs work. The roof leaks and the fence is down, but the bones are good." Elias looked at the deed. He saw the future in the ink. He saw a porch where he could sit without a gun in his lap. He saw horses grazing in the mist. He saw her. "Clara," he choked out. I have nothing to give you for this. I am a cripple with a bad heart and a dark past. I can't buy you land. I can't buy you peace." Clara took the deed from his hands and set it on the nightstand. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You saved my life, Elias," she said, her voice fierce and tender. "You pulled me out of the ice. You fought for me when you couldn't even stand. You gave me back to myself." She kissed him, slow and deep. "This land is yours," she whispered against his lips. "So am I. We will build it together." Elias looked at her, and he finally believed her. He finally accepted that the penance was over. The war was over. "Together," he said. The final scene was quiet. The sun was just beginning to crest the mountains in the east, painting the sky in bruised purples and brilliant golds. The light filtered through the window of the small bedroom, touching the dust motes dancing in the air. Elias' heart lay asleep in the bed. He was on his back, his breathing deep and even, the sleep of a man who no longer needed to listen for footsteps. His arm was thrown out, heavy and protective, draped over the space where Clara had lain. His face was relaxed, the lines of tension around his eyes smoothed away by rest. The scars were still there, the history of violence written on his skin, but they were just marks now, not open wounds. Near the door, leaning against the frame, was the Sharp's rifle. It was there, kept clean, kept ready. He would never not be a soldier. He would never not be a protector. But it was across the room. It was not in his hands. Clara stood by the window, wearing a simple white nightgown, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. She held a mug of coffee, the steam rising in curling ribbons. She watched the town of Cedar Ridge waking up below. She saw the smoke rising from chimneys. She saw the baker opening his shop. She saw a world that was messy and loud and dangerous and beautiful. She turned back to the bed. She watched the man who had brought her here. The man who had thought he was dead, but had turned out to be her life. A small, contented smile touched her lips. She turned back to the window and watched the sun break over the ridge, flooding the valley with light. The long winter was over. The snow had melted, and for the first time in her life, Clara Dawson wasn't looking for an exit. She was just watching the day begin. Thank you for riding along with Elias and Clara on this journey through the snow and the scars of the American West. It has been an honor to weave this tale of survival and redemption for you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in the mountains, the city, across the ocean? Please leave a comment below and share your location. If this story touched you, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of the frontier. And I invite you to share your thoughts on the ending in English. Did Elias and Clara find the peace they deserved? Until the next campfire, travel safe.